Hello, everybody. Good to see you. I was saying before, it feels like we've changed time zones since we last met together. The weather is very different. It's freezing cold when we were last together, and now it's balmy, at least today. So I'm going to answer a question. Miranda is not sick. She is on leave. So I've been asked that several times. She's not unwell. Look, I'm looking forward to this topic tonight. This is separation between church and state, which is quite fascinating given it's Roman Empire and Constantine and all that kind of didn't seem like much separation to me. But and I see over to our right we have a panel, an interview panel.
Yeah, too.
Yeah, a little intimidating. Glad it's you, but it'll be good. And I'm particularly looking forward to it because I think the rhetoric of today's kind of public narrative is church should stay the heck out of anything to do with politics, and also like even the last week I was told by somebody I was being political because I was speaking to something which I considered was a justice issue, and they told me it was a political issue, and what were church people doing talking about politics? And I was like, I don't quite see it the same way. But anyway, interesting. I'm interested. I'll be eager to hear what you're saying. Let's pray as we start. Father, thank you for what Matt is about to share with us. We pray that you give him energy and you give us ears to hear. And while we might think this is history, I think we've all been quite stimulated by the content and what it has meant for us both as a church then and what it means for us now. So may you do the same for us tonight as we hear Matt take us through all this rich content. We pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, Matt.
Amen. I think you have to, just to kind of bounce off Jason's point, it's not going to take me long to kind of jump into that dynamic of when is something religious and when is something political. What you have to remember is that certainly in their context, that isn't a real thing. Like the distinction between those two things doesn't really exist. When you're like government, your emperor is saying that he's a god. It's very hard to divorce politics and religion. I guess a larger thing to say is that I'm just as a personal bias thing, I'm a deliberately centrist kind of guy, kind of actively centrist. And you'll see that in a lot of the way that I try to approach this. I'm not necessarily advocating for a Constantinian, like there are people who think that Constantine was very, very bad. And there are going to be other people who say that Constantine was very good. And I'm going to try to be a bit even-handed with that because I just think people are people and they have their good moments and their bad moments. And so it's probably more complicated than that. But that also raises other really interesting issues of like how are we meant to respond? And Jason's kind of alluded to that. So I want you to basically come out of tonight just a little bit irritated. Irritated in the sense of having to go off and go. I was uncomfortable when Matt actually showed that this, and you might be coming from a more kind of an approach of like keep away from politics, or you might be coming from Jason's kind of no, politics is justice and those kind of things. You might be coming from a position of thinking like no way could the church ever have anything to do with the government. The very fact that they went with Constantine is what went wrong with the church. Or you might be coming from no, we should be like, putting more Christians into politics and stuff like that. I want you to be irritated by the end because it's never that simple. It's never that neat and tidy. Okay? So having said that, it it is relatively neat and tidy on one level, and that is you have two very distinct eras during the early church period. You have a time where, when I write this up on the board at Tabor, I put a big frowny face on one era, and I put a big smiley face on the other side of it, because there is a time where they hated us and the government and the church relationship was awful, and then we have another time where it's just dandy, right? And both of those have their problems. Okay, so let's start with the persecution one and talk about that. Now, you might remember, so one of the other things is I am aware that it has been a sort of a long time since we last met, and there are things that I actually talked about in the very first week that you might have fuzzy memories of. I always have this problem with students that, like, I think they should remember every single word that I've given them like a drop of gold. And part of me is feeling guilty that if I revise stuff and tell them, like they're like, I already know that, you already told me that. But I've also been around the traps and had to humble myself long enough to know that there are times where students go, I don't remember a single thing you said 3 weeks ago. So, like, yeah, remind me. But, so does anyone remember this image? I gave it to you the first week. So this is Saint Sebastian, and Saint Sebastian was famously executed during the reign of the Emperor Nero, right? So the Roman emperor wasn't going to take all the growth that we've been talking about over the last little while lying down. As they saw the church growing, they got increasingly nervous, and they saw all of this as socially dangerous, very dangerous. And it wasn't just religious, it was political, it was everything. The early Christians died because they would not obey the state in a civil matter. People often say to us that the early church did not show any civil disobedience. So Jason will like this quote. They do not know church history. Why were the Christians in the Roman Empire thrown to the lions? From the Christians' viewpoint, it was for a religious reason. But from the viewpoint of the Roman state, they were in civil disobedience. They were civil rebels, right? The Roman state did not care what anybody believed religiously. You could believe anything. You could be an atheist, but you had to worship Caesar as a sign of your loyalty to the state. The Christians said they would not worship Caesar or anybody or anything but the living God. Thus, to the Roman Empire, they were rebels, and it was civil disobedience, and that is why they were thrown to the lions. So let's unpack that a little bit. There's a classic movie called Spartacus, right? From back in the day with, you know, who was in it? Kirk Douglas and that kind of thing. But there's one scene in that where two Roman senators are walking down the street, and one of them says, hey, let's have a party. We'll go out and have a real good old-fashioned animal sacrifice with the gods. And another one says, wow, you believe in the gods? And then the Roman senator says, privately, I believe in none of them. Publicly, I believe in them all. Okay? And what's his point? His point is that that's fine from the Roman Empire's point of view. You can believe whatever the hell you want, but as long as you play your part, play your role, just run along with the prevailing narrative, everything's going to be fine. So what you believe personally, no one cared about. But publicly, the worship of the emperor was about you saying, we think the Roman Empire is flipping awesome. Because the emperor represented the empire, and the empire, you might remember us talking about, was a miracle. It was a technological miracle to have the peace and security of that, to have the roads that allowed you to go from like Egypt to basically the edge of England without ever having anyone harass you. To have trade from all over the world come, to be able to get spices from Asia through Alexandria and stuff like that, with no problem at all. That was a miracle. To have the architecture, to have the plumbing, to have all of those things was a miracle. And the emperor was a representation of that. So when you were worshipping him, whether you believed he was really a god or not, it didn't matter. What mattered was that you were then saying, I love this whole empire thing, and I would die to protect it for the good of my family, for the good of society, for the good of like everyone that I care about. Do you see what I mean? So when Christians go, look, we think that dude's great, but we're not really interested in that. And when they say to you, why? And you say, because I actually worship a different son of God, a different man God. And then they go, but if he's a son of a God, then he's a king, like he's a ruler. And you go, yeah, he is. Well, what kingdom does he represent? Oh, the kingdom of God, with a whole different set of ethics and a whole different way of running things and a whole different political structure. Do you realize just how subversive that sounds when you actually look at it? Right? Just to kind of nail on that point, one last thing. Romans, like the book of Romans is written to the church in the capital city of this empire, right? And its whole opening like paragraph is about how Jesus is an emperor. He's a king. You go look it up. Like that, he has been, proven to be a ruler of the universe, and appointed by God, validated by the Spirit, son of David, anything like that. That is not just a religious statement. That is a political statement. Any church that got found with even that first opening paragraph is going to have a very, very bad day. Okay? Right? We do not just represent a different religion. We represent an entirely different way of doing the world. And that's going to tick people off anytime you're doing something like that. So the Christian's identity in the early church was as a persecuted minority. It shaped almost everything about them. At the same time, this shows yet again the power of what I call a Christian open system attitude. And what an open system attitude is one where everyone gets to participate. Everyone has a role to play. So do you remember how last time we were talking about the community engagement stuff and how that was always about lifting other people up so that they could participate as well? That's what I mean by an open system approach, is where everyone is being treated not as a burden, but actually saying you have a role to play too, right? So at first, the primary source for Christian persecution was just the mob. But over time, that changed and it became emperors. Okay? Over time, the role of emperors in the persecutions increased as they became threatened by the rise in Christianity within the population, what they came to refer to as the empire within the empire. So, again, you have to realize how political all of this became. We literally had an entirely different bureaucratic system that was working alongside and rivaled just the standard running of life. So one of my favorite examples of that, you know how Paul has that bit where he says, hey, you two, I think it's in Corinthians, he says, you two, you're going to court. Why would you go to court? You should really settle that within the church. Who remembers that bit? Well, the early church's response to that was to take it so seriously that they actually went, yeah, let's do that. So when there is any civil, not a criminal thing, you can't really work that out, but if there's ever a civil debate, like a civil court case that needs to be done, we'll run that civil court in our own court system. So if you want to sue someone, don't sue them through the Roman system, come to our courts, and we will set up an entirely new justice system. Did you know that? Now, it became known as the ecclesiastical court. Now, what was hilarious was that actually became a really effective way of doing mission, because there were people who went, well, the Roman courts suck because they're corrupt, they're unfair, they don't make any sense, they're bureaucratic. So you know what we should do? we should go to the church courts because they're so much better run. But we can't because we're not Christians. Oh, well, I guess we better become Christians so we can go to the Christian court system, and off they went. And this is what, so the quote, empire within the empire, actually comes from Decius. And Decius literally ended up going, we have an entire, we have this group in our empire that are running their own court system, and everyone wants to go to their courts instead of ours. That's awkward. Okay? In terms of if you wanted an education, you didn't go through any of the educational channels that the state were endorsing. You went through the church because it was better than theirs. Do you see what I mean? And none of that is just religious. That's political. If you've got an entirely different justice system being run where people voluntarily go to it because it's better than yours as a government, that is not just a religious thing, that's a political thing. So let's start talking about some of the different emperors and their approach to persecution. Now, I'm going to skim through some of these because some of these you might already remember, but I'll roll through. So the first one that we'll talk about is Nero, and that obviously comes back to Sebastian. While isolated exclusively to Rome, his persecution in 64 AD was very intense. From a contemporary, Tacitus, so Tacitus was an historian from around the period who didn't like Christians very much, but even he thought we got a rough trot at Nero's. He said, an immense multitude was convicted, mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames. These served to illuminate the night when daylight failed. So Christians became street lamps. Now, admittedly, Nero was pretty small time in terms of his persecution. He only did that locally in the city of Rome. It didn't go out anywhere else, but it still had a bit of a bang. The next one is Domitian. Domitian, D-O-M-I-T-I-A-N. Domitian, right? Now, Domitian is an interesting one because he's from AD 81 to 96. And he was the first sane emperor to insist on being called my Lord and my God. Now, when I say sane emperor, you might think anyone who comes up with that as the title is probably not. But I'm making the distinction between him and Nero. Nero was quantifiably nuts. No one had a problem with that. And of course, Caligula is the other one that kind of went around saying that kind of stuff. And he was quantifiably nuts. Domitian did it for political reasons, right? What he wanted was for people to, as we were saying, to say, I, as a representation of the Roman Empire, are a god, which means that we are a religiously powerful thing as an empire, right? So now that term, my Lord and my God, is a very interesting one. In Greek, it's o Kyrios mou ke o Theos mou, right? Now, in the New Testament, in John 20, you might remember someone saying, my Lord and my God. Do you remember that? Right? In Greek, that is o Kyrios mou ke o Theos mou, right? And what that is when doubting Thomas sees Jesus for the first time, he says that. Now, most scholars would argue that John writes that gospel in the early 90s. Okay, it's like John's the gospel that after the synoptics have been written, John goes, oh, they missed a few things, so I really need to tidy that up. Okay, so he waits until near the end of his life, and then he goes, they never told about this story. Well, I'm going to put that in. So off he goes, right? So, but as well as that, John is very selective in the stories that he chooses. Remember, he says in there that, I could have told you a million stories. There's no end of the books that could have been written. So he's very selective in what he tells you. And one of the things he wants to tell you right smack bang in the period where Domitian is emperor, is that Thomas, when he saw the risen God, used the exact same title for Jesus as, as everyone's being told to have for Domitian. Do you see that? So, like, you can almost imagine John sitting around hearing people having to start to say, my Lord and my God, to Domitian, and then going, hey, I've heard that phrase before. All right? So again, even something as like seemingly, like you might think, wow, religiously that's really significant when Thomas says that, but politically it's pretty innocuous. It is not. Like, it is a really, like, it's a very subversive, very taken down the government kind of statement to say. Okay. Several prominent Christians were killed in Domitian's persecution, including a Roman consul, his own cousin, Titus Flavius Clemens, and his wife Domitilla in 95 AD. He killed his own wife because she was a Christian. Next, we have Trajan. And you might remember I mentioned Trajan earlier. Trajan was given a report about Christians from a governor in the province of Bithynia, and the guy's name was Pliny. And he's the guy that said, what am I meant to do with all these Christians? They're driving me crazy. And Trajan created the policy that you might remember that, listen, don't make a big thing about them. Don't hunt them out. Don't, vacuum seal it. Don't give them any credit. Don't look for them. Don't hunt them. Don't do anything. But if you find any of them, kill them. By the way, if you find out that a mob have killed them, turn a blind eye, it's fine. Okay? And that was basically the policy that would go on until Septimius Severus in 211 AD. Right? So that's pretty much taking up 100-ish years of the Roman Empire period, is what we might call ad hoc persecution. Right? So it's bad. Lots of mobs kill us, and we'll look at a few of those later. And there are times where it might heat up in a particular area and stuff like that, but it's not a systematic kind of a thing. Then you come to an emperor that you might remember, and that is the guy Philip the Arab. And of course, Philip the Arab, you might recall, the only reason I bring him up here is because he's the one that doesn't persecute us during this period. And everyone goes, oh, actually, maybe Christians aren't so bad. From 211 on, there was a relative peace for about 40 years. This was the period when many Christians actually began to hobnob with the imperial family. With this new degree of comfort, it actually became trendy to become a Christian. To become a Christian was actually a trendy thing to do. This added more power and responsibility to leadership. Remember, eventually this emperor enraged the pagan populace by actually supporting Christianity, even having an openly Christian wife, Ottocilia, and then things changed. And you might recall me saying that they didn't really have elections, but if they did, the elections were to get the army on board. And one of the chief things that the next emperor was able to say in terms of, gee, my policy, should you make me emperor, was I'll go back to really killing Christians, and I'll do a better job of killing them than anyone ever has before. And that leads us to Decius. So Decius is Decius. Decius. Right? So Decius came in and realized that, like, just doing a basic diagnostic of the Roman Empire, it was starting to die. It had run out of a lot of its flair and its power. Now, there were several reasons for that. Historians have been able to identify quite a few. One of those was that the Roman Empire had been extremely exploitative of a lot of its natural resources within the Mediterranean. Like, they just used stuff up. They didn't really think in terms of environmental long-term damage, and that meant that a lot of the time they just eradicated stuff, and that's not really going to work out very well for you in the long term. So there were things like that. There were a whole host of other things. But from his perspective, he was like, well, why on earth is this happening? Aha, it's because, well, we know why these kind of things happen. We were going down the toilet until Caesar Augustus came along, And he was the guy who had said, we'll get Zeus back on board. And then the empire went great. So obviously what's happened is we've had this new religion come in and they're slowly weakening us. They're weakening us. First of all, they're weakening our relationship with the gods, and so the gods are angry with us. But as well as that, they're weak, and they give voice and power and empowerment to the weak. And you might remember that the Romans' approach was you throw out babies that you think are weak because they're going to weaken the empire. So Decius went, Christianity is the problem. In his mind, this had to be because of Philip's failure to sincerely uphold old-time religion. The solution was to return, viciously if necessary, to paganism and emperor worship. And from his perspective, it was a national security issue. Okay? Again, it's political. Christianity was a danger to the state. It was a threat to the health of the nation. Okay? For the first time then, persecution arose not from religious fanaticism or popular hatred, but from cold and calculated administrative logic. Okay? So, whereas previously under Trajan and stuff, during that 100 years or so, where Trajan was doing his thing, what had happened was that, hey, just ignore Christians, but if they really give you a bit of bother, then, snap them out. And if a mob gets to them, just turn a blind eye, right? So that much more ad hoc, laissez-faire approach to it. What Decius did is he said, we have an administrative engine in the Roman Empire. We know how to hurt people. So we're going to put the full administrative weight and power upon of the Roman Empire upon Christians to crush them. And the way they did that, I think I mentioned this, was they basically made it so that you had to get a really interesting, some of the parallels. What they did is they said, you need to just go to an administrative office, a temple, but it's an administrative office. You need to pick up some salt, which we'll provide, and you need to grab that salt and then just throw it on an altar and say, Caesar is Lord. That's it. You don't have to, and again, you don't have to believe it, you just have to do it. And then what we'll do is we'll give you a certificate, and that certificate says they sacrificed to the emperor with the emperor's own salt. It's really pretty cheap. It's nothing that spectacular. And once you have that, then you can trade. Then you can come into society. Otherwise, you're not allowed to be in society at all. All you need to do is just do that. And most people did. And most people didn't care because it was all just made up. And you didn't need to be a fanatical believer in the emperor's deity. You just did it because it was just part of the thing. But Christians went, no, we won't. And then he went, great. So you can't trade now. You can't live now. You can't do anything. Now, as well as that, he instigated systematic persecution of leaders and would kill them and things like that. But yeah. Now, having not been persecuted for almost 40 years and having become largely consumers, the Christians were completely unprepared. Many compromised doing a sacrifice. And ultimately, that became a major source of division in the church later on. Because you can imagine, if you're in a church where one pastor had his hands chopped off because he wouldn't do the sacrifice, and you've got another guy who kind of fudged around the edges or maybe got a forged labelli so that, labelli was the certificate, a forged certificate so he could still do things. After that, that could cause a little bit of awkwardness in the church afterwards. Now, you're meant to forgive people, but forgiveness can be a tricky beast to do. You know what I mean? It's interesting. There are some really interesting parallels that you can emerge out of this. Okay, so Decius represents a very systematic approach. And then the last one is Cabbage Dude, right? We're back to the cabbages. We're back to Diocletian. And with Diocletian, the perpetrator of the Great Persecution, Bibles were burned, church buildings destroyed, Christian meetings were banned. Remember, though, as part of Diocletian's reforms of the empire, he'd split it in two. Do you remember me talking about that? So you had an eastern side and a western side, right? Well, part of what that meant was that because he was the emperor of the East, and did a few dabblings in a few other areas, but primarily in the East, that meant that while it was a terrible persecution, it was mainly isolated to one side of the empire. Now, the emperor on the western side was much softer, and his name was Constantius. And you'll never guess who his son was. All right? So that gives you a brief overview of some of the kind of major to's and fro's of Roman imperial policy around persecution. Now, what's particularly fascinating is how Christians responded to that. And what Christians developed over that time was actually a spirituality of martyrdom. Do you remember me talking about the idea of theosis? Right? So theosis was that idea that God became human so that humans could become like God again, like be restored to the image of God. And that got all tied up with the idea of Christ-likeness, and we'll come back to that a little later. But what that meant was that to die in persecution at the hands of the Roman government, who does that remind you of? It reminds you of Jesus. And so to become a person who was dying in the same way as Jesus became a profoundly religious, spiritual experience. It became seen as a great privilege for Christians to die that way. I remember a few years ago, Blackwood Hills Baptist did this thing where they during Easter, they got a guy to carry a cross, like to dress up as Jesus and carry a cross through the main street. Don't know if any of you, they still do it, right? Yeah. You were probably there at the time, and yeah, and I remember actually the guy who played Jesus in that. He was one of my students at the time, and I asked him, "How did you find that process?" And he said, reenacting the cross was one of the most profound religious, spiritual experiences of my life, because I got to really understand in a new way, and it almost felt like Jesus was working with me and in me, and I was participating with him in some way. It was a deeply spiritual experience for me. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, just warm him up before Jason, giving him a few beatings just to get him into character. But like what I always found, what I found really helpful about that was, if that's true of acting it out and pretending it, you can imagine the significance that it would have had to actually have done it. So let's keep on going. The intensity of martyrdom became a powerful spiritual force for the early church, charged with incredible symbolism and theology. Some people actually went out of their way to be killed, like they handed themselves in to be executed, and the church ended up saying, you don't do that, all right? You can't actually go up to them and say, "Hi, I'm a Christian, can I be executed today?" That's just not okay. You don't. But the fact that there were people who wanted to do that. Did I tell you the story of Origen and his mum? I told you that story. So Origen was a great theologian, and when he was 16, his dad was executed. 16, 17. His dad was executed as he was martyred, and he was so impressed by his dad, and kids always want to be like their dad, that kind of thing. So what happened was, he went, "Mum, I want to go and be martyred just like Dad." And she went, "Well, not dressed like that, you're not. Like, you're looking very..." Very smart woman is Origen's mum. And she goes, "Listen, you better clean yourself up, son, before you go down there. You want to be looking spick and span when you're being executed, don't you?" And he went, Yeah, Mum, darn right. And so he went to the bath, and while he was getting washed, she stole all his clothes and hid them. And then he came out and went, Mum, where's my clothes? And she went, I'm not telling you where your clothes are until you promise me you won't go down and do something stupid. Right? But the fact that there were 16, 17-year-old guys who were like, hey, can I go down and be executed today? Like, you got to have something. Now, on one level, we're all sitting here and going, so they were crazy. But on one level, understand how profound and moving the experience of dying for Jesus must have become for them by that point. Okay? And so the attitude of the persecuted must have completely flummoxed many, as we see in the early Christian leader Tertullian. So you might remember Tertullian's just this guy who's just doesn't care about the government at all, really hates them, and as a Christian. And he wrote this: why evildoers are eager to escape notice. They avoid appearing. They shrink the court. They deny when accused. Right? That's what everyone expects. We've caught you and we're going to execute you. No, please, I'll do whatever you say. And he goes, but look at the Christians. There you have quite another story. Not a man of them is ashamed of it. Not a man regrets. If he's denounced as a Christian, he glories in it. When he's condemned, he renders thanks. Right? Just imagine that. I'm sentencing you to execution. Like, really? Wow. Can we do it today? I can adjust my schedule. If we can get this done, I'm on. Right? How do you respond if you're like the Roman government in that kind of a situation? Because the whole reason why you're doing this is to be a disincentive. And if people are going, yes, that is counterproductive. You know, like my son is a bit like this sometimes, where you say to him, you know, go to your room, and he goes, well, I like being in my room. Right? Well, basically they told him, go to an eternal room, and they go, I like being in that eternal room. Now, add to that the complexities of other things, such as that the Roman religion did not have a happy real estate when you die. Right? It was very ambiguous. I didn't really think it was that spectacular. So if Christians are like, I know where I'm going and it's awesome, now that's made it an evangelistic opportunity. Because everyone knows, like, the mortality rate, like for a lot of us, we live in a world where we think, hey, death is a very abstract, long way away. That is not how they lived in the Roman Empire. Okay, mortality was around the next time you get a scratch on your arm, you could be dead within a couple of days. Okay, so to hear a bunch of people who were simply not afraid of death was quite scary. Why did Christians love getting killed so much? Well, the first one is Jewish precedents. Right? There were precedences that meant that Christians actually liked that. Now, all of you are good Protestants, so you would never have actually read the Apocrypha. But if you had, you would have potentially read a thing called... so the Apocrypha are a series of Old Testament books that aren't really in the Old Testament, but they span the time between the end of Malachi and the beginning of the New Testament. So if you've ever wondered what was going on during those 400 years, the Apocrypha provide us with that. And the early church had no problem reading them at all. They didn't see them as having the same canonical authority as the Bible, but they still thought they were really good. And one of the main ones of those is about a group called the Maccabeans. And the Maccabeans were Jewish people who, when Greeks came in and tried to force Jews to worship the Greek gods instead of Yahweh, they fought against the Greeks, kicked the Greeks out, and started a kind of Jewish republic for a little while. And it was run by a guy called, whose name was Maccabeus. But in the story of that, so there are 4 books of the Maccabeans. If you do want to read one, don't read number 1. It's really boring. go straight to number 2, because number 2 is just fun. Okay? Like the guy who he literally says in his preface, look, there are historians who write like all the really important stuff, and then there's people who write the fun history. This is that one. Okay? And in that, he tells this cool story of like this mum who has 7 of her kids brought in, and she's told, tell them to denounce Yahweh, or we'll kill your sons. And then the first one comes up and they go, we'll kill him. And he goes, send me to Yahweh, I'm not afraid. And then like she goes, go on, son, I'm proud of you. And the next one, come on, mum, we'll be all together with God by the end of the day. And like the Greeks are like really struggling. And like they get through all 7 of them, and then they kill the mum. And it's just this story of like the Jews not bucking down and everything like that. If you're reading that to your kids at bedtime, which is what the early Christians were doing, okay, all right, that's going to lead to you having to steal their clothes when they're 16. Okay. Number 2, the expectation of immortality. As I've already said, the expectation of immortality. The Christians did not have the same fears as everybody else did about death. They knew where they were going. And by the way, it was going to be far, far better than what they were getting served up to them here. The idea was essentially to speed up the experience that every Christian would have in the resurrection. Right? Whether you die today or you die in, 10 years, you're still going to end up being resurrected. What the hell? Either way, I win. So might as well just get there today, because I'm pretty sure the next 10 years are not going to be that great. So, okay. Right? And everyone watches that and goes, so seriously, there are reported cases of the very people who are executing the Christians being so impressed by their courage and their lack of fear about execution that they themselves hand themselves over to the rest of the soldiers and say, you might as well just do me, right? I've been so impressed by this person and their hope for the afterlife, okay, right? And this leads to the next one, which is the imitation of Christ. This comes back to my point before. Throughout the Christian literature, we often see the idea that to die in martyrdom was a chance to imitate Christ's passion. Eusebius, who was a famous historian of the period, points to this in his treatment of the Gaul massacre of 177. More than simply an emulation of Christ, like just copying him, or even discipleship, kind of following Christ, right? These were strong themes, like we're following Christ and stuff. This was often understood as a participation with Christ. You can almost think of it as kind of like a virtual reality experience. Have you ever had one of those things where you've done like Google goggles, or one of those kind of things where you stick the thing over your eyes and you've got the earphones on, and now you're walking through like the place and everything like that? Well, the experience of being martyred was like that, like almost portrayed like that by Christians. That it was the experience of almost putting your Google goggles on and being Christ in the process of the persecution. And you see a lot of the time in what are called martyrologies. So martyrologies are where the stories of martyrs are retold. A lot of the time, they really ham up, emphasize, highlight any kind of correlation between what happened to Jesus and what happened to that particular martyr. So a good example of that is a guy called Polycarp. And Polycarp, when he's executed, there's a mob and there's a governor who's trying to placate the mob, but he doesn't really know, and he doesn't really want to actually execute Polycarp, but he's kind of stuck because the mob's kind of forcing him and yelling at him and everything like that. Does that remind you of anyone? And so like they would like really highlight those kind of things to say Polycarp gets it, right? Now this leads to another one, which is beyond participation. you actually had this spiritual experience of Christ in the martyr. A real sense that Christ, it wasn't just that you were doing this and understanding cognitively Christ better. It was that when you did that, you were so spiritually connected to Christ, and almost kind of like the empathy that you were experiencing of Christ meant that Christ's Spirit was connected to you on a really profound spiritual level. Okay? Kind of the best way I can describe it is with a woman called Felicitas, and I'll show you. Right? No worries. So Felicitas. So this is Felicitas, and with her is a woman called Perpetua. Right? So this is the story of Felicitas. But respecting Felicitas, for to her also the Lord's favour approached in the same way, when she had already gone 8 months with child, for she had been pregnant when she was apprehended, as the day of the exhibition was drawing near, and like that's the public execution, she was in great grief. And you're like, of course she is, because she's pregnant and she's about to be executed. Lest on account of her pregnancy, she should be delayed. Because pregnant women are not allowed to be publicly punished. So they had a policy, right? Unless she should shed her sacred and guiltless blood among some who had been wicked subsequently. So she's really bummed that she might have to wait to be executed and then be executed with just like some thieves and stuff. And she's like, but I really want to be executed with my friends. Okay, so moreover, also her fellow martyrs were painfully saddened lest they should leave so excellent a friend and as it were a companion alone in the path of the same hope. Therefore, joining together their united cry, they poured forth their prayer to the Lord 3 days before the exhibition. And what are they praying for? God, get us out of this mess. No, that is not their prayer. Their prayer is, can you hurry up and get her to give birth so she can join us? Because she'd really like to come along. Right? Immediately after their prayer, miracle of miracles, her pains came upon her, right? And when, with the difficulty natural to an 8 months delivery, in the labor of bringing forth, she was sorrowing, and obviously, like you know what sorrowing here means, like she's screaming, crying, and all that kind of thing. One of the servants of the cataractary were the main soldiers, so this is one of the servants of the soldiers, said to her, "Ha ha! You are in such suffering now. What will you do when you are thrown to the beasts, which you despise when you refuse to sacrifice?" So you're screaming now, you'll be screaming a heck of a lot more when you're thrown to the lions, this kind of a thing. And then listen to what this woman says. And she replied, "Now it is I that suffer what I suffer. But then there will be another in me who will suffer for me, because I also am about to suffer for him." Thus she brought forth a little girl, which a certain sister brought up as her daughter. So do you hear in that the dynamic of Christ will be in me, and he will suffer for me because I am suffering for him? By the way, she was 16. Can you imagine going to a youth group and saying, "Hey, lift," like, you know, "Oh, someone texted something mean about me being a Christian." Like, everything is different. The next one, the sacramental aspects. So when I use the word sacramental, I mean that for them, they had a deep belief. This is a pesky one for us Baptists. They had a pesky belief that Jesus was actually in the bread and the wine. I'm really sorry to bum you out with that, but they weren't memorialists. The early church was not that. They genuinely believed that Jesus was in there. How he was in there, they had no idea, but they just kind of went, it's a thing. So what that meant was that to eat and drink the wine was a participatory experience of ingesting Christ and taking Christ's pain and suffering. This is my body broken for you. all that kind of stuff. But what's really interesting is that martyrs would pick up on this. We see it in the martyrdom of Polycarp and in Ignatius's letter to the Romans. So this is Ignatius about to be eaten by a bunch of lions, right? And you might remember Ignatius was this guy who was sent by Trajan to be executed, being eaten by lions. And when he wrote several letters on his tour to get there. And the last letter that he wrote was to the Romans, because the Roman church was going to try to get him out of being executed, right? And he told them, don't, right? So his last letter was to the Roman church, who were apparently planning to spring him to get him out. And he wrote, I'm writing to all the churches and assuring them that I am truly earnest about dying for God, if only you yourselves put no obstacles in the way. I must implore you to do me no untimely kindness. Pray, leave me to be a meal for the beasts, for it is they who can provide my way to God. And obviously what he means by that is like, I'll literally be before God tomorrow. Don't postpone that process. And then he says, I am his wheat, ground fine by the lion's teeth, to be made the purest bread for Christ. Isn't that fascinating? This makes sense since it fitted with the idea of being baptized into Christ's death, or the idea of a sacrifice, which was an easily identifiable motif in the Eucharist and in martyrdom. All right. Finally, last couple, the next one, action more than just words. Christians of this period were not really just about fine speeches and really good theology. They actually wanted to live it out. Obviously, we should be wary of overstating the case here. Christians did argue for the faith, but the strongest argument they had was what they did, simply because it was so remarkable and different, and in a word, miraculous, compared to anything anybody else saw. Martyrdom was the ultimate expression of this. The Christians' peace and even joy in martyrdom was miraculous. In regard to martyrdom's missiological effect on the Romans, Ramsay MacMullen has argued what pagans saw in Christianity, in the sense of being drawn to it, depended greatly on what they saw of it. It's worth asking if our standards of action would even qualify in comparison. Okay. Next, community. It is perhaps ironic that this is an element of martyrdom, considering the two schisms that later occurred because of persecution. We could talk about that another time. Nonetheless, Christians lived together and they died together. In every letter he wrote on his way to execution, Ignatius talks about unity. He began his letter to the Ephesians, those united and elect in suffering. This had a remarkable effect. It meant that by the time Diocletian had finished his great persecution, the Roman Empire's energy for persecuting Christians just kind of ran out of gas. And so we come to the second half, which I'll do in like 20 minutes. We got that? That's about right. Which is Constantine. So, what do you do with Constantine? Well, I like to think of Constantine the way people talk about Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so who knows the story of Juliet? Like, you actually did it at school. You saw the, Leonardo DiCaprio movie, right? Like, part of the idea of that is that they're actually two good households. They're households that people actually both admire. They just hate each other. And part of what I want you to realize is that the church is a great thing. And for a lot of people, the Roman Empire was a great thing. They just didn't like each other very much. And so what that meant was that many people throughout history have kind of, and at the time, really wrestled with, can these two come together in some way when Constantine made that proposal? And it wasn't just Christians who were making that decision. There were also, on the Roman Empire, there were lots of people who were like, I don't want us to get in bed with Christians. They're 10% of the population. They're weird, they're immoral, in ways that aren't like us and everything like that. Who's to say that they're not the ones that have, messed up the empire? That kind of thing, right? Yet 1700 years later, the issues stemming from Melvian Bridge have not gone away. we still have to wrestle with them. We still have to wrestle with, so what I want you to realize, if you think that, I don't really think the church should get in bed with government, don't worry, there are plenty of people on the other side of the coin that go, well, I don't want that either, right? And so we're going to kind of wrestle with that tension, basically, until Jesus comes back. If we don't understand why this created such a storm, even, or perhaps especially to the present day, it's perhaps helpful to think of Chesterton's church dies to be raised again metaphor. So one of the things about G.K. Chesterton, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but G.K. Chesterton, a famous theologian, and he said the church has this amazing ability that whenever it looks like it's going to die, it rises again, for it knows someone who knows the way out of the grave. Right? So he says, over history, there are countless times where the church looked like it was on the floor and it was dead. And then it just got up. And the thing that was killing it died. Right? When was the last time you were really hassled by a Viking? Vikings, during, say, the Middle Ages, they looked like they were going to kill us until we took them over. Right? You know what I mean? And so, the thing is that obviously one way that the church looked like it was going to die is when the Roman Empire was trying to kill it. That's a very effective way to make it die. But perhaps the thing that really comes close to killing the church during this period, where we come over to the Constantine side, is obesity. Right? The church gets a bit flabby around the midsection because they lose, right? We can be accused of having become a fat church, losing some of the vibrant and energetic sense of subversiveness that had kept us so strong before Constantine. But nonetheless, for all the problems, Christianity stayed alive and actually lasted longer than the Roman Empire did itself. So, let's talk about this bad boy. Here's Constantine. Now, there's lots of perspectives on Constantine, and I'm going to just go through and kind of smash you with some basic facts. I'm not going to colour things for you. We're just going to see how you go. Right? So, fact one. Constantine did win a battle, and the battle was called the Battle of Milvian Bridge. That's just fact. And he did that in 312. Constantine won the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 against his rival Maxentius. Maxentius was much more from the Diocletian school of Christian policy. He wanted to wipe us off. Constantine beat him. Okay? 2. Constantine had some kind of religious vision before that battle. Now, that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying Jesus visited him. I'm not saying that, light came from heaven or something. But you can say pretty definitively he had some kind of religious vision. And you can also say he is the first person to have a Christian symbol used in battle. All right, so if you have a look at this picture, I'll zoom in. Do you see that there? All right. You see here how it's got these crosses there? That's the artist. Who's the artist again? Romano, that's right. Romano is trying to actually convey this idea of him going in with a Christian symbol. That's not actually the Christian symbol that he used. He used this one, which is a Greek chi or chi and a rho or a rho, so a chi rho, and that's of course the first 2 letters of Christ or Christos in Greek. And so that's actually the symbol that he used. Okay, but he did do that. He's the first person in history to have used a Christian symbol in battle. Okay? Constantine was directed in a dream to mark the heavenly sign of God on the shields of his soldiers and thus to join the battle. He did as he was ordered, and with the cross-shaped letter X, or he marked Christ on the shields. Right? That's just fact. You might debate the meaning and subtext of those facts, but that's what they are. And again, Constantine, said that about noon, when the day was already declining, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of the cross of light in the heavens above the sun and an inscription, and the inscription said, "Conquer by this," right, attached to it. Then in his sleep, the Christ of God appeared to him with the sign which he had seen in the heavens and commanded him to make a likeness of that sign which he had seen in the heavens and to use it as a safeguard in all engagements with his enemies. Now, that's what happened. You can make all manner of fascinating interpretations of what that actually means. You can make the interpretation that he made it all up. You can give that a shot. You can make the thing that God came to him and just blessed his living socks off of him. You can do that too. You can make it that, well, he's Italian. He had a really bad slice of pizza, and that just meant that he was just having a bit of a cuckoo wawa day, and he saw some crazy stuff, and then, interpret it. You can do that. You can make it, heck, plenty of people have, you can make it that one of the other gods, like the demonic gods, came to him dressed as Jesus and said, yeah, God would really, like Jesus, well, I would really like you to actually do something that is completely antithetical to the turning the other cheek thing. You can do that too. I don't care. You do you. But at the very least, we can say that this is the report that was given. All right? And it's worth also pointing out, not everyone was convinced by his conversion, even at the time. Okay? Right? I stole a meme. I feel bad already. Like, there are a lot of people who were like, really, dude? Right? This from one of the, Eusebius, one of the historians, who interviewed Constantine, and he said, a most incredible sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which might have been hard to believe. I wonder why, had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterwards declared to the writer of this history and confirmed it with an oath, who could hesitate to accredit the relation, especially since the testimony of aftertime has established its truth? So he's writing much later about, like, Constantine said this to himself, and then he did all this great stuff for us, as if he could lie. Now, the reason why I highlight that is because Eusebius, who's the historian who says that, has to say that. Why does he have to say that? Because there's a bunch of people who don't believe him. You see what I mean? Think about it for a minute. So you've got an institution called the Roman Emperor who has worked for 200 years to kill you. And then one day they go, oh no, dude, I'm totally on your team. Hey, why don't you all gather around me? The soldiers, they're there for your protection. Trust me. What's the worst that could happen? Like, you think everyone's just going to be, oh, okay, that sounds right. All right. Lots of people were very suspicious of Constantine. I once heard a guy called Christopher Hall, and he said, imagine moving overnight from an Iraqi church to a US mega church, and think of how that would affect your brain, like the cognitive dissonance you would have. Okay? Still, let's do straight facts. 4, Constantine did set what was called the Edict of Milan, which formally protected Christians from persecution. Now, the emperor on the other side of the empire, on the eastern side, was a guy called Licinius, and he also signed, but he wasn't happy about it. He did it under pressure from Constantine. Right? Now, all these facts are looking very good for Con right now. You see what I mean? However, he also continued to put what was called the Sol Invictus God on his coins for quite some time afterwards, having been a devotee to that God for some time beforehand. So you could make the argument that, well, either if he's doing yay, 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 Jesus, but at the same time putting on all of his coins, yay, yay, the Sol Invictus, you could make the argument that at the very least, he has not figured out that it's a monotheistic religion. You could also suggest he's playing both sides. You could also suggest that he's just making it all up. Okay. But straight fact, 6, he helped strengthen Christianity and weaken paganism politically. Right? That is just straight fact. This from the historian Eglin Hinson, he says, from his conversion until about 324, when he took up the fight against Licinius, Constantine extended tolerance to other religions and displayed limited favoritism to Christianity. So it's slow, just work your way up to it. From 324 to 330, he adopted a harsher attitude toward paganism and leaned ever more heavily on the churches. And after 330, he dropped all pretense of toleration and did all he could to eliminate paganism as well as divergent forms of Christianity. Right? He just went straight all in. Now, you can argue whether his methods were bad. You can argue whether he was very heavy-handed. You can argue all manner of things about you don't like the way he did it. But the still fact is he did it. Right? He went, I want to help Christianity out and I want to stop paganism. Right? 7. Right? Constantine's church in Byzantium was built for him, right? Oh, the thing, my little thing has gone off. So that yellow line, it's too far south. It needs to be from Rome over to Constantinople. Sorry, that's a hiccup in the thing. But he literally left Rome. He left Rome as the capital of the Roman Empire and built a new capital for himself in Byzantium, and then decided to call it Constantinople, because that's how Con rolls, right? And then he built a church there in Byzantium, and it's called the Hagia, well, it eventually became called the Hagia Sophia, and he built 13 tombs. And then his mum went looking around for all of the bodies of all of the 12 apostles. Seems legit. I gave it a shot and tried to get all of those. But did you notice how many I said? 13? Who's that 13th grave for, do you reckon? Right? So she's got 12 graves for the apostles, and there's a 13th just waiting for one fella, Constantine, right? So Constantine's church in Byzantium was built for him to be seen as the 13th apostle. The whole move of the capital from Rome was partly driven by Christian devotion, since the Roman Senate was still adamantly pagan. Okay, 8, Constantine didn't get baptized until he was about to die. And people always say this is a sign that he was a very bad person, right? That meant he couldn't take the Eucharist, which was kind of a big deal for them back then. And he made this excuse. His excuse was, I would have got baptized earlier, but I really wanted to be baptized in the Jordan River. But who has the time to go down there? And I was like, you could just use any old water. And he's like, no, but I want it to be special. I was like, really? You know, it reminds me of guys who do that with like their girlfriends. Honey, I want to get married. I really do. But we just need to wait. And really? Okay. 9, he flip-flopped over the Arian debate right up until he died, when he was baptized by a man strongly suspected of being an Arian sympathizer, a heretic, Eusebius of Nicomedia. So that dude, his name is Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he's a heretic. And he's the guy that baptized Constantine just before he died. It's not a good look, right? At worst, he was an Arian heretic. At best, he didn't understand the significance of the debate. And the last point that I have, monotheism was already becoming politically popular in the empire anyway. The rate of people becoming Christians, do you remember that graph I showed you? That indicates that he might have gone, hey, Christianity, why not? Because it's the wave of the future, and I think I can strengthen my own claims to the throne if I do that. So that leads to another question, and this is kind of one of the questions I want to finish with, is, was it all just politics for Constantine? Was this all him kind of going, how can I wangle Christianity to help out my claims to the throne? Well, the claim that Constantine was looking for something to unify his fractured and weak empire is often made, that really Christianity was a means to an end for him. I want to make some suggestions about that. It's worth remembering these points. 1, Emperor Philip shows it wasn't going to do that very well, right? 50 years before, you get Emperor Philip even, pretending to have a sniff of a possibility of maybe becoming a Christian emperor, and people did not like that. And Constantine would have known his imperial history. So he would have been kind of like, if it didn't work out for Phil, it's probably not going to work out for me. So rather than this being an incentive for him to become a Christian, Philip the Arab actually represents a warning to him not to do it. Do you see what I mean? Next, let's remember Christianity at the time when Constantine converted represented how much of the population at the time? Does anyone remember? Hazard a guess. 10%. Exactly. Well done. You do remember what I say. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. Okay. All right. Now, if you've got, imagine there was a group in Australia that represented 10% of the population. You might say, well, that's a reason for them to be tolerated, but you wouldn't say, so that now needs to become the official worldview of everyone in the state. Would you? Right? Next, Christian disunity was already evident to anybody who looked. So, like, there's this argument that says Constantine went, hey, it's like buying a car from a really bad used car salesman. Right? He didn't check under the hood. What he did is he went, hey, I've heard Christianity is like this really good monotheistic religion that could unify an empire around one God. And they all just love each other so much. And if we get everyone just loving each other because they all agree all the time because they're Christians and they're all unified and stuff, then everything will be great. And then what happened was he drove the car out of the lot, and then it kind of spluttered, and he looked under and he went, whoa, heretics! Oh, no, it's not as unified as I thought it was, right? That kind of thing. The problem with that is like, because he opens it up and suddenly there's Arianism. It's like, Arianism? No, what am I meant to do with that? The problem with that is that if he'd actually looked for more than 5 minutes, he would have found that there were lots and lots of heresies already, and that Christianity wasn't actually that unified. Right? Now, of course, they're heretics, so they don't count as Christians. But like from his perspective, right? Think of the Marcionites, the Valentinians, the Gnostics, the Montanists, just to name a few. Irenaeus, who was a theologian from Lyon in Gaul, where Constantine had spent vast periods of his life, had written a 5-volume work on all the divisions within the Christian church 150 years before Constantine's conversion. So there's a 5-volume book about Christians not agreeing with each other, written in Constantine's hometown, basically. If he was really doing this from a manipulative point of view, and he's making the story up about the sun, the shining lights and the conquered by this, if he was making that all up so that he could actually have like a mechanism for unifying the empire, he would have done his research, right? You don't do that kind of thing without doing your research. And it would have taken him 5 minutes of research to find Christians argued about all kinds of stuff during this period, right? So you have one way of thinking, and one way of thinking is that he went, hey, I'm looking around for a way to politically use religion to unite my empire under a monotheistic religion where everyone will agree. Christianity looks great. Oh, no, it's not as neat as I thought it was. Or there's another way of thinking. The other way is that he became a Christian. He had a genuine religious experience, and he interpreted that religious experience in terms that said, I'm going to become a Christian now. And then he was a politician. And any politician who suddenly finds themselves with a certain circumstance goes, okay, how can I spin this to my advantage now? I'm a Christian. What can I use that for? Well, I suppose it's a monotheistic religion. I reckon I could use that. If I spin it right, we can make that the basis for unifying the empire. Do you see how that works? Now, you might still say that second one's shady politics stuff, but it's not quite the same as the other one. Do you see what I mean? Okay. Now, to finish, all I want to do is fast forward, and I want to fast forward to Theodosius. Right? Now, I might have mentioned this to you before, but it's worth just remembering. The full political transformation that all this has had can perhaps best be finished up with the Emperor Theodosius, who ruled from, he was born in 347 and he ruled and died in 395. An entirely devout Christian emperor, he commissioned the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople in 381 to tidy up the hiccups left from Nicaea. But perhaps the best example of the power shift is his relationship with Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan. In 390, Theodosius punished the people of Thessalonica for a rebellion against their albeit barbarian governor. They got really stroppy at the governor. And Theodosius was having a bad day and he was really ticked. So he sent a letter to the general who was put in charge of punishing them, and he said, just go in there and just slaughter them. Stupid Thessalonians. And then what happened was that the guy went, okay, boss, and went in and killed like thousands of Thessalonians. And Theodosius felt really bad about it, and he sent a second letter going, whoa, sorry, man, I kind of overreacted there. And the guy didn't get the letter before he killed like thousands of them. And that was very bad. When Theodosius did that, it caused an outrage across the Roman Empire, especially among the Christians. And the most powerful Christian of the day was the Bishop of Milan, Ambrose. And so what Ambrose said to him was, you will not come into a church and you will not have the Eucharist until you do a year of penance. A year of penance. That year of penance means you have to walk around and do your job as the Emperor of Rome in sackcloth and ashes, humiliating yourself for a year. And Theodosius did it. Isn't that interesting? Especially when you realize that that's in 390. 85 years later, 85 years before that, the same position, the same political position, the Roman emperor is Diocletian, and he's trying to kill us. So in the short span of 85 years, we went from emperors killing bishops to emperors going in sackcloth and ashes for an entire year because a bishop told them to. Do you see the significant power shift that's taken place there? And what that testifies to is the radical power of how ineffective martyrdom had actually been, how entirely counterproductive to the Roman Empire's whims and goals it had actually been. And on the flip side, the remarkable change that Constantine had brought about. Now, you might think that that was bad in any number of ways. You can quantify and measure that, and you can ask questions about it later. But either way, that change happened, and it was remarkable. Cool. Let's have a break. Cool.
Is that working?
Yep.
Kind of. I'll just say yep again.
Yep.
That's good enough. All right. Thank you, Matt.
Nice.
I wonder, I did ask online if anyone had any questions. They didn't. But Ashley Taylor said that the young people going off to martyrdom, sorry, I'm dropping my chocolate, 5-second rule, reminded her of World War I and II. People heading off to war. All right, now, are there any questions? This one wasn't on the floor, just so you're not like worrying about me.
There is no judgment, there's only grace. It's all good. Yeah.
So this sort of relates back to previous sessions, but when you say pagan, I mean, all throughout this you're talking about pagans as in the Roman Empire. Yet, when I think of pagan, the first thing that comes to mind is a lot more druidic stuff. Druidic type stuff.
Druidic and stuff.
Yeah. Yep. So, and these days, when people say, "Oh, I'm a pagan," they're thinking more along Celtic, those sorts of terms. How are the two things related, or are they, or is it just too much of a generalised term?
Okay, so how do I do this really quickly? So, the term Druidic is a fairly elastic term for a more generalised religion over several different ethnicities. But those ethnicities are primarily located in places like what we would call Ireland, to a lesser extent Wales, lesserish, and then Scotland, with aspects of those same religions coming out in other places such as like Germany and Norway and places like that. But it's primarily in those places like Ireland and the British Isles and everything like that, with the lesser extent of England during this period, because of course by this point England has been colonised by the Romans. Okay, so if you're familiar with Boudica, and like I said, Boudica was like a more Celtic, rebellious kind of person against the Roman Empire during the Emperor Hadrian. So that's just around this kind of ballpark. They didn't like Christians either, and they killed them for different reasons. But in a similar kind of vein, it was about our religion and our politics are deeply entwined, and we're going to not like you being Christian in our area. That ends up migrating into a story probably outside of our period, which is the story of Patrick, right? And also St. Columba and people like that, who emerged just at the end of the Roman period, sliding into the beginning of the medieval period. I mean, Patrick's a Roman, where they start the process of converting the Druids. So it's pagan, but it's a different type of pagan. Yeah.
So folk often say that persecution's good for the church, and that what Australia needs is a good persecution to kind of bring vitality back to Christian faith. What would you say?
I don't think it's as simple as that, because there are places where persecution has not occurred, where Christians have been able to do amazingly good things without that impediment. And you can make a legitimate argument that the standard quality of the standard of living, particularly for poor and marginalised, but also the standard of living for like the kingdom bringing by the church, significantly improved when they weren't being killed all the time. Right? That is a legitimate argument that you can historically make. And there are plenty of times where we have been viciously persecuted and then we don't exist to help anybody. So I don't necessarily think that you can make a blanket statement that like correlation does not equal causation. But what I will say is that that sometimes you can definitely point out that Christians are very good at ticking off people who are not doing good things. When Christians are doing the right thing, they're very good at ticking off people who are doing the wrong thing.
Like as in unjust
stuff.
Yep. Okay.
Right. And having just not caring about the consequences of that, and having two key characteristics of Christians throughout history have been their fearlessness and their just stubbornness. The thing that you hear about the Romans would constantly complain about is how pig-headed Christians were. And so I wouldn't say that persecution is a magic ticket to tremendous growth. But I would say that persecution can be a natural consequence of when we're doing some really good stuff. It's not as simple as saying, if you do good stuff, you can guarantee you're going to be persecuted. Doesn't mean either, if you're being persecuted, that must mean that you're doing good stuff. But what I can say is that sometimes those two things line up really neatly. And you could ask yourself, if we are, and I think my first quote points to this, if we are not ticking people off, it could be because they all think we're awesome and because we're just so nice, or it could mean that we're a little too domesticated. And it's not my place to decide on that, but it might be part of that itch I was telling you at the beginning. So, yeah.
Hi. Do you not think that we are being pig-headed, and we need to be pig-headed right now because the Christian church is being persecuted by the political governments?
Yeah, I can see what you mean. I think there are two basic responses that people will give to that. One is to say that there is a symbiosis between those things. That what I mean is sometimes when you start to be a little bit pig-headed, you get persecuted. And then what happens is you go, well, fine, I'll be even more pig-headed, which leads to more persecuted. And so back and forth. So you can see that kind of a thing. I will also just say the definition of persecution is always relative. And I'm hesitant to use the same word for some of what we would identify as persecution when I know what is going on in places like Afghanistan right now and in many other parts of the world where if you go to the Open Doors website, for example. So Open Doors is a place where they tell you stories of what persecution is really like. So I want to live in a world where I acknowledge the significant challenges that we as Christians in the West are facing and don't discount those, don't recognise where that's examples of us showing courage and things like that, while also having a healthy dose of perspective that none of us are being shot yet. And so we have to kind of keep that sense of perspective.
And also remember that yet could be a word.
Yet, yeah.
As in, like, it's hard to imagine Australians shooting Christians because Australians are too practical.
Mm-hmm.
But then I reckon Nazi Germany was hard to imagine.
20 years before, 15 years before.
Turn of the century prior. Yeah. So who knows what kind of stupidity happens.
So you mentioned earlier about like mob violence against Christians and sort of like crowd murders and things like that. I guess I was wondering, like, after Constantine, after Constantine's whole thing, how, like, do we know how quickly actual kind of public perception of Christians turned around? Because I kind of, so like, I can't imagine that the emperor suddenly the emperor being Christian would suddenly mean that there's no risk to Christians from mobs or anything like that. Do we know how quickly that changed?
Yeah, that's a good question, Taz. So you really need to actually break it down to 3 periods. So there's the period of up until Septimius Severus, where the mob violence at a local level is a common experience. Okay? So think of it as kind of the dynamic that you're talking about there is bottom up persecution, and then you have top-down persecution. During the period of the up until Septimius Severus, which is 211, you have mainly bottom-up mob violence, sanctioned, occasionally prodded a little by the state. Then what you have is 40 years of very little persecution whatsoever. Like it just becomes, Christianity's pretty mainstreamed. And the reason is because Christians are doing so much public good, as we looked at the week before about community service, that the population itself, even if they're not becoming Christian, which many of them are, but even if they're not becoming Christian, they're like, well, I can't really do that because Bob's actually getting a fair bit out of the church at the moment, so I'd feel a bit rough screwing him over, that kind of a thing. And so when you come to a point where there is renewed persecution under people like Decius and Diocletian, it's now top down. It's not so much bottom up anymore anyway. Sure, there are people who are kind of like, hey, I'll jump on the bandwagon, the government's doing their thing, sure, I'll go on top of it. But now it actually has to be led by the state and funded by the state, which is a different kind of dynamic. So once you get to Constantine, most of the gas of that kind of a thing has run out. When you finally get to the point where you have, do you remember we were talking about the Emperor Julian, who gave paganism just one last go? You know, baby, let's try one more time. By that point, no one's interested in even trying paganism, let alone persecuting Christians. So, yeah, as a ground up mob kind of dynamic, it's really not that strong by, you know, the early 3rd century.
I'm interested in Constantine, and it seems that there's some need for people to try and figure out whether he was a true Christian or not. I don't know if any of you have met politicians who are Christians, but they're politicians and they're Christians. And why I say that together is I don't know if a politician doesn't know how to be a politician,
yeah,
and how to leverage. Like they're constantly leveraging circumstances, and it just kind of reflect on that with us.
And that's the exact point I was making at the end about whether he chose Christianity for political ends. I personally don't think that's viable because of what I said before. I think he would have checked under the hood, right? And he would have, if that was his goal, he would have looked under the hood and he would have gone, ugh, there are better options than that in the Roman Empire for a monotheistic religion to unite my thing. And there were rival monotheistic religions, Mithraism and stuff. But I do think he's a politician, and just as a politician who has like an accident that results in him having a dicky leg, will go, okay, well, I've got a dicky leg now. How can I spin it? You know, like what can I do with this to actually gain some votes? You know, that kind of a thing.
Well, not even that. So I do know numbers of politicians, and I notice when they think about bringing social change, they think quite differently than I do as a pastor. So they think about using political tools, legislation, mobilisation, advocacy, these kinds of tools, because that's their game. And as I listen to you reflect on Constantine, I think he's using the tools that an emperor has to try and bring social change. I don't doubt he had, it seems to me, faith experience, and probably, given that it was fairly early on, they probably hadn't processed. I mean, by the time you get to Baptists, they're starting to process the political and the state kind of engagement, but that's a long time off from
Yeah.
there.
I mean, Jason, let's frame it less in terms of politics and let's frame it more in terms of military and as a soldier. Okay, that might be actually a helpful way to approach this, because Constantine isn't just an emperor doing administrative stuff. He's also a military guy trying to use a military mechanism, the army, to both protect it from external factors, which aren't really that big of a deal during his period, and also to utilize, they don't have a police force. They have an army that does things for both foreign and domestic enemies. Does that make sense? So what that means is that Constantine has no problem using a military force to do some dirty business, if necessary, to bring about good ends. Right?
Like American presidents.
I'm not going to talk about that. But what I will say, is that there are going to be strands of Christians throughout history who say, and that's why we know he's not a Christian, because Jesus is all about peace and love and forgiveness and turning the other cheek and non-violence and stuff like that. And as Baptists, we have interactions, relationships over periods of time with the Anabaptists, and the Anabaptists were frequently, pacifist, Mennonites and stuff. And so part of our history as Baptists is a sense of thinking that no Christian could be involved in something that involves violence. So when you hear the story of Constantine in that kind of context, you're going to go, there is no way that Jesus would have ever said the words to anyone, conquer by this. Jesus would never say that to anyone, because that's not how Jesus rolls. He would have gone to Constantine and said, convert by this, and convert would mean go on a preaching tour, Constantine, and renounce your violent ways. Do you see, like, that kind of an approach? I totally respect that approach. I totally understand where people are coming from. But it's kind of the same as the question of, should you have people who take on roles of authority within secular contexts, be they politicians in government, members of the army, members of the police force, and that kind of thing. And that raises interesting questions, because you could say, like from this point of view, the point of view that says, God wouldn't be involved in any of that kind of dirty business, you could make the argument that we shouldn't. But then the counter argument is, do you really want a police force where Christian values are not involved at all? Do you really want that? Or do you want Christians, however messy that may be, to be involved in figuring out how to be good cops? Honest, decent, good cops. And do you really want a world where, so there are people on one side of the thing that would say, keep Christians out of politics. That's a very Anabaptist Mennonite perspective. Totally get that. They're very anti-Constantine. But then there are other people who would go, we want more Christians in those places because they will legislate in certain ways to ensure that Christian values are upheld. And the people over this side are going to go, as soon as they do that, they're going to get their hands dirty in ways that are compromising Christian principles, because that's inevitable. There's some people on this side who are going to say, we'll get in line with reality. And do you see how there's an idealism and a pragmatism that's wrestling there? All I'm trying to do is make you itch. Whichever end of the spectrum you are on that, itch, and go scratch it in prayer.
I wonder if you can guess which side I stand on.
I can't imagine.
It's really helpful what you've shared with us tonight. And I mean, there's probably a number of points of being inspired by our own history. But I love the tenaciousness of Christians in whatever context they've been in, how they've stuck at it. And it's actually hard to live in the complexity of our times faithfully. And if it looks messy, that's because it is. So I'm grateful that that's a helpful thing for us to realise, because it's pretty messy now too.
Yeah, and I mean, it just occurs to me, just as a final thought with what you're saying, I think we can create too much of a black and white thing in thinking, well, the Christians, when they weren't in bed with the emperor, you know, never compromised. And then when Constantine came along, they just bowed down and said, whatever you say. The reality is that it's not that clear cut, because you have, after Constantine, you've got the period where Arians take over the church for 50 years, and the church went, no, we're not going to deny Christ's divinity. And you have Theodosius doing his thing of killing the Thessalonians, and the church going, no, we won't give you a free pass to do that kind of behaviour. So, like, just because we end up having a relationship with the government doesn't mean that historically we just bow down and let them do whatever they want. We still maintained a deeply subversive element. And we kind of need to, even when we do have people in political power who are purporting to be Christians and stuff.
Let me pray as we finish. Father, thank you for your hand over the church. Jesus, you said that you'd build it. And that wasn't just something simple that would roll out inevitably into the world and everyone would be glad about it. But it turns out that there really is a battle. There really is such a thing as the gates of hell needing to be overcome. And there really is such a thing as evil powers and unjust rulers, principalities and powers. And in the midst of that, you've kept people faithful to you, being subversive and following the way of Christ. I pray that in our time we might be able to find our way. Help us be faithful ourselves. We pray especially, well, I pray especially for those who bear the name of Jesus and are in significant societal roles in government or in industry. And I pray for them, because I know that there's more complexities in the decision-making that they need to have than most of us have to wrestle with. So help them, have mercy on them, help them have your wisdom, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everyone. We're back again next week. And what are we doing? I can't recall.
We're actually going to look at another subversive element during this period, and that is the desert monks.
Okay, the desert monks. See you then.
Yes, I have.
Have you read the blurb where it says, I'm standing for this ward, I live in the area, either I am a member of the political party, associated